Hello, konnichiwa, oi, ciao, aloha, kia ora, kaisho, etc. And welcome to my talk today. I hope that we're all enjoying this year's Polyglot Conference. I'm Karla Zuluaga, and I work as a linguist in the language revitalization and maintenance field with the Anandiliakwa language on the Groote Eylandt archipelago of Australia, which is located just here. Today, I'm going to talk about how Indigenous languages and cultures are vital for closing the gap. And for those of you who are not from Australia and perhaps unfamiliar with the phrase, the gap refers to the distinct divide between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians in terms of socioeconomic aspects of life. But more on that later. First, I'd like to start off with an acknowledgement of country. In Australia, we use an acknowledgement of country to show our respect to the traditional owners of the land. Kaningapa, adababa ngaywa waramamalia langwa manja ngalia, and abura langwa ayangadarba. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging from the Groote Eylandt archipelago and any other Indigenous peoples who may be listening in today. Before we get stuck into it, I thought maybe we should look at the diversity of Indigenous languages here in Australia. Prior to colonization, there were around 250 to 300 languages in Australia and even more dialects. Nowadays, that number of languages that are still spoken is reduced to less than half, and only 12 of them are in a relatively strong state. And that just means that it's spoken by all generations, but still the health of Indigenous languages in Australia is quite severe. I would like everyone to keep this map in mind throughout my talk, because it's important to remember that there is a large diversity of cultures and languages here in Australia, and that one cookie cutter approach cannot be used to fix everything across the country. Any strategies that are developed need to be done in consultation with communities to see if it will work in that particular context. So what is the gap and why is there one? So this gap, it refers to the stark inequalities that are experienced between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. And it includes, but is not limited to things like life expectancy, whereby Indigenous Australians experience 10 years shorter lives than non-Indigenous Australians, and that gap is even larger in remote communities. This low life expectancy is linked with poor health. So there's more malnutrition, chronic diseases, and there's a lot less access to these health resources, particularly in remote communities, to address them. So on top of that, there are 20% less Indigenous Australians completing high school and even less in tertiary education. There are low employment rates, there are low family incomes, and high incarceration rates. But why is there a gap? There are many deep-rooted reasons, so please excuse me for giving a very surface-level summary today, as there's not really enough time to go into depth. But one of the main causes, which is also responsible for language loss in Australia, is colonization. Previous policies have sought to erase Aboriginal culture, first through genocide, then many years later, a kind of cultural genocide, whereby children were taken from their families and forced to stop talking their languages and practicing their cultures. This happened for decades, and it's what we now call the stolen generation. This disconnect from families and culture has caused intergenerational trauma. Intergenerational trauma can happen when there's traumas in one's upbringing, which can then result in behavioral problems, violence, substance abuse, etc., and is passed on to the next generation. This video provides much better explanation for that process, and it's really incredible for describing the cause for the struggles of Aboriginal Australians today. So just give me a moment and I will share this video with you.
Imagine a line of well-being. You have ups and downs, and that's normal. Before colonisation, Aboriginal people also had their ups and downs, but overall our spirit was strong. Aboriginal people had a strong culture for tens of thousands of years. When the dominant culture arrived and they took over our land without our permission, the process of dispossession began. The loss of land and disruption to our way of life, ignoring the things most sacred to our culture, including our family kinship systems, language, traditional law, cultural practices, and looking after country. The dispossession brought massacres, poisoning, and disease. We lost our freedom, physical safety, and health, all of which impacted on our well-being. They introduced legislation and policies to assimilate us, with the ultimate aim to breed Aboriginal people out of existence. They even took our children from us. We lost the right to move freely in our own country and to see our family. We did not have access to legal systems. We were not allowed to get an equal education or receive equal health care. They took half our earnings and we had to get permission to marry. Our basic human rights were denied. All of this pain and loss can break your spirit. No matter where you are in the world, no matter what colour your skin is or how civilised you think you are, if people no longer have those basic human rights, their well-being will plummet. And this is exactly what happened to us as Aboriginal people. The well-being of whole families and communities through generation after generation suffered. Despite all of this, Aboriginal people endured, and through the resilience of our spirit, we survived. Slowly, policies and practices began to change, and the journey of our recovery begins. But it's not an easy thing to overcome, and many of our people are still living in a place of despair and hurt. When you are oppressed on such a large scale, and for so long, a lot of despair builds up. Eventually, you start to normalize that. This is how it is for our people. The oppression has become internalized. When people go through trauma, they often rely on their family and friends to be the strong rocks that support them and help them to recover. But what happens when everyone around you is also going through the same trauma? Those rocks that you try to hold on to pull yourself up are also crumbling. And like all human beings, what we don't heal in our own lives, we sometimes pass on to our children. When there is internalized oppression and low well-being for generation after generation, along with a society that views you with negative stereotypes, racism and prejudices, it may lead to family violence, alcohol and drug use, incarceration, illness, mental health issues, and low emotional and social well-being, even suicide. Children who are born into this environment might not always have the same opportunities and may start to view the world as harsh and cold instead of feeling love, warmth, and security. This is called intergenerational trauma. Now, don't get me wrong, our people are strong and resilient, and there are plenty of us living happy and healthy lives with strong connection to our families, community, and culture. But many of us have family and friends who are struggling, and when we try to help pull them out, it can be very easy for us to get pulled back in. Let's think about the economy for a moment. The white man comes to our country, and with them, they bring a whole new social and economic system. Our people were stopped from doing things our way, even though it had been working well for us for a long time. Yet we were also locked out of the new systems. This systematic exclusion from the economy and social systems throughout multiple generations has led to the many disparities in the social determinants of well-being that our people are challenged with today. Over time, there have been other cultures that have migrated to Australia who have also been subjected to discriminatory legislation like the White Australia policy. they too have experienced racism and discrimination. However, unlike our people, they were allowed to stay together, keep their children, maintain their cultural ways, and participate in the economy. Whereas our mob has only been allowed to participate in the last 40 to 50 years. As we can see, it's a big and complex challenge that we are facing. Even after the policies of colonisation ended, the trauma of these policies and practices still echo down the generations. I'm not talking about ancient history either. Some people say, it happened 200 years ago, get over it. Sure, the oppression may have started 200 years ago, but it has only started to change recently, less than 50 years ago. The last of the 1905 Act was only repealed in 1964 and the Native Welfare Act in 1972. So when were your parents born? When were you born? Many people living today are survivors of those oppressive legislations. The struggle to heal communities and achieve self-determination and equity takes time. The impacts of past policies are still felt today. And now we live in a contemporary society, but there are new policies and legislation that still impact negatively on Aboriginal people. We also need to change society's negative stereotypes and attitudes towards Aboriginal people. Participating in modern Australia shouldn't mean that we have to forget our culture. In fact, quite the opposite. We know that strengthening, reclaiming, and reviving our culture and language builds our resilience and is healing for our people. Many of our mob are healing and living strong and healthy lives with a strong connection to our culture. We can still go hunting. We just might use a four-wheel drive to get there and be using the latest fishing rod instead of a spear. We can still have a strong spiritual connection to our country and the land. We can still speak our language, sing and dance, have ceremonies, paint our pictures, and pass our stories to our young ones. We can still respect our elders, share tucker with our family and loved ones, and care for our kin. We can maintain our cultural and social obligations to family, community, and country, and be respected as the first people of this nation. We can live and thrive in modern Australia as equals. That's what Aboriginal wellbeing is. So how long does it take for people to recover from this trauma and the lasting effects of colonisation and dispossession? Well, we actually do have some idea. Because unfortunately, people have been oppressing each other and inflicting trauma on each other's cultures all around the world for centuries. The evidence tells us that the impacts of trauma on the individual may be felt for many generations after the initial trauma. So if we know that on an individual level, the trauma impacts on future generations, what are the effects of the trauma inflicted on a whole race of people for multiple generations? We can assume that it might take a lot longer to recover. But our people's spirit is strong, and we are recovering. However, it is important to remember that right now in Australia, we are smack in the middle of a transition phase. We know that recovering from colonisation and dispossession is a process that takes time. But through engagement, partnerships, and systemic change to attitudes and policies, we can speed this process up. What does this mean? It means recognition of Aboriginal people as the first people of this nation, engagement and partnerships to support Aboriginal-led community-controlled initiatives, building sustainability through increased education and workforce opportunities, addressing the social disparities and providing equitable access to services, ensuring that there is a broader understanding of Aboriginal culture and history in schools, universities and workplaces, providing culturally safe services that challenge racism, systemic bias and stereotypes, recognition and support for cultural strengths that contribute to well-being, helping to maintain reclaim and revive Aboriginal culture and language, strengthen Aboriginal people's basic human right of self-determination and equity, and sharing the vision of all Aboriginal people living long, well, and healthy lives.
I hope that video was really informative and helpful for understanding the effects of colonization and intergenerational trauma that Aboriginal Australians are experiencing. But I'd like to also add some other causes that are affecting this gap in Australia. And that includes that, especially in remote communities, there is a real lack of services and funding for things such as health, schooling, and legal services. And there's also a real lack of cultural understanding between Indigenous communities and the predominantly non-Indigenous government and institutional bodies that make decisions that affect them. So you may have noticed that the gap in my title was in inverted commas. Closing the Gap is the name of an actual government response that's to reduce the inequalities based on these key targets. So these targets that you see here on the screen, this diagram is from a website called Know Your Country. You can look it up and have a read for more information. But anyway, these are the targets of the Closing the Gap policy. They cover issues such as health, education, employment, etc. And languages and cultures only come up in target number 16, but I want to actually demonstrate how it is actually very important to achieve the other targets, whether it be directly or indirectly. So these targets that are highlighted here are all to do with education. And I wanted to start off with education because it seems like the most obvious point where language can be advantageous. In a majority of Indigenous communities where Indigenous languages are still strong, it is so essential to building language and culture as part of the curriculum. For many kids in remote communities, English is only learned when they get to school. So actually, in an ideal world, these children would have access to bilingual education. But unfortunately, although there was a strong push for this in the 70s, in many schools, this has ceased due to the lack of funding, among other reasons. But at the very least, teachers who are coming into these communities should be trained for teaching kids to whom English is not a first language, and should also be aware of cultural differences. In particular, I would like to mention that there needs to be an awareness of Creole and different varieties of Aboriginal Englishes for teachers in remote communities, because these are often languages and dialects that are deemed incorrect English, which is incredibly detrimental for children that live in these communities where this mode of communication is the norm. And so imagine being told that the way that you and everyone you knows is speaking in an incorrect way. Like, how engaged do you think that a student will be in schooling, and how do you think that's going to make them feel? Do you think that's going to be conducive to wanting to stay in school and to learn? Probably not. Their languages, both new and traditional, as well as their culture, should be celebrated rather than something that is pushed aside by an English-dominant school system. Kids can see when something negative like this is happening and will become disinterested and disengaged with an institution that doesn't value their culture. We can see that in many schools that were once bilingual schools, and they've all seen drops in attendance and literacy rates since removing these programs. It's a clear indication of the importance of language in the schooling system. Next, I'd like to move on to the issue of employment, as it's very closely linked with education. Keeping children in school plays a vital role for gaining employment, which is another key target here. If children are engaged enough to complete their studies, they're more likely to be able to pursue higher education and gain employment with a higher salary than that probably otherwise would have been possible to them. This opens up a huge range of professions that Indigenous people are underrepresented in. For example, in medicine, in law, in education, and it's so vital to have culturally competent people in these roles, as they so often deal with Aboriginal communities. I mentioned before that it was necessary for teachers in Aboriginal communities to be culturally competent, and it would be even better if there were more qualified teachers from the community to keep children in schools and act as a role model for them. Tertiary qualifications can also lead to more fully trained interpreters and translators for Indigenous languages, which there is actually a real lack of at the moment. And this is really necessary for providing equitable access to services where maybe there's no native speakers, particularly in high stakes interactions, such as those that occur in the health or the justice system. So this only shows how implementing Indigenous languages from early on in education can have roll-on effects. Obviously, it's not the only factor, but it is a necessary one. And it shows that the benefits of language and culture may not always be immediate, but they shouldn't be discounted. In terms of health, it is one of the more prevalent issues when we speak about the gap in Australia, and there certainly needs to be more funding. But in terms of what language can do, having either health professionals in the medical field that speak the language and understand the culture, that can help to build rapport with patients and demystify a lot of medical talk. Furthermore, it has, if one has a good education, they're more likely to make better lifestyle choices. So these things can affect health, such as eating well, refraining from things such as smoking, alcohol, drugs. And on the side of mental health, study shows that speaking one's heritage language has shown to have benefits related with health and well-being. And this is not just for communities where language is in a relatively strong position, but even for those where language may be in a revival phase. Learning the language can bring about a stronger cultural connection. And this strength in culture and language also connects back to being more involved with society and economic activities such as employment. Language is important for closing the gap. Indigenous languages are an important factor across many targets, as we've seen today, whether it be directly or indirectly. It's not going to help everything, but it's definitely a factor to keep in mind when fixing up the problem. Another thing is that there is a large diversity of Aboriginal cultures and Torres Strait Islander cultures across Australia. And this means that a single strategy cannot be implemented nationwide, but rather a community consultation is essential for success. Here are some links for a bit of further reading if you're interested, including last year's National Indigenous Languages Report, which is very informative. Thank you so much for your time. Salamat, gracias, okini, iairai kere, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.